First step, make sure you're in the Eevee render engine. Second step, go to your shadow section. Make sure soft shadows is off, high bit depth on, and crank these up to as high as you want. And then set your freestyle to between 0.5 and 1. I found works best, but that'll change depending on your models. Okay, first set up your scene, get your models. This is a Unit 1 model I found online. I believe I just Googled Unit 1 3D model. I found it online. They said it was free to use for all purpose, no credit required. But I will try to link the model in the description if I remember. So very important to have high subdivisions and very clean topology. So you see lines, harsh, sharp, but it's also very smooth. If you have a janky model, you're gonna have janky shadows and it's not gonna look good. So the material, everything is based on this very simple material. It is a diffuse BSDF to shader RGB to a color ramp set to constant blend mode. You have your highlights here, the lightest colors highlights, and then your darkest colors, what your shadows are going to be, and you control them by sliding them. Every material will require a different variation in the color ramp. This material has a medium amount of highlights, but this material has a lot of highlights. Now, once you get your nodes made, put in the colors you want. Colors are very important because a lot of older anime is a little bit faded, but it's got some interesting hues. It's saturated, but also faded at the same time, if you get what I mean. I don't know. But colors are very, very important. If you want to learn what exact colors older shows used, take a screenshot of them, find a screenshot online, and get the direct hex codes. The next step is your lighting, very important. I use area lights only for this. You can use whatever you want. Please experiment and make sure contact shadows is enabled for each light. So I use 3 light sources for this model. Normally I use 1 or 2, but I wanted lots of reflections, so I bumped it up to 3. So the first light source, offset rim light, just to kind of give the model a silhouette. The second was the same thing, but it was a smaller area light angled downwards, just to highlight this part of the face compared to this part of the face. And then the third light was to highlight the back end. This is basically it for the blender part of this process. It's very simple, very basic shaders, very simple lighting. Keep it simple because older animes were hand-drawn. It wasn't very complex. So you want to keep it simple. Few amount of lights, basic shaders. Now go to View Layer Properties, scroll all the way down to Freestyle. Now in your Freestyle settings, I select everything except the last 2. Suggestive Contour, Ridge and Valley, kind of gives some janky, weird lines that aren't useful for me. So I like to keep these settings, play around with them. It'll be different every time. Now this specific scene was rendered at 720 by 720. You're not going for quality here. You don't want this to look like a render. You want it to look like someone took a screenshot of a show and then posted it online and it got reposted 40 times. That's the goal here. All right, so you bring your render into Photoshop. The first thing I did was I cleaned up the lines with the paintbrush. I smoothed out some of the harsher lines and the harsher shadows. I just touched it up because sometimes it doesn't look the exact way you want. You can get close, but it does require a little bit of painting and editing. The first thing I did was add a motion blur to the entire scene. I merged the background and the render together, and then I set the motion blur to saturation. Now what this does is it kind of just bleeds edges a little bit. It might be hard to see, but it's most noticeable in this orange right here, where if I take it off, it's clean, it's harsh, but this bleeds into the colors and gives it more of an older look because the colors are kind of bleeding like you're watching this on a shitty TV. I duplicated that exact same motion blur and then added a hue blending mode. Now with the first motion blur, it adds a different color hue to where it is blurred. As you see, it's blue here, it's blue here, it's blue here. We don't want that. So the second motion blur is set to hue. So it'll match the hue. So these blurs now become purple. They become the color of what it's actually supposed to be. Now I duplicated the motion blur yet again. I changed the blending option to exclusion and set it down 35%. Now this really muddies things up and desaturates the shit out of it, but that's what we're going for. Trust the process. The final blur was a Gaussian blur. I set it to light. It gives it that dreamy feel, but I brought it down to about 40%. It accentuates the highlights and gives it that dreamy feel. Now the most important part is the adjustments. This specific scene had a lot of adjustments and every single render will be different, but this is what I base each scene off of. The first thing I added was a gradient map. This is a heat map I found online. It's purple, orange, blue with blacks on either end, and I changed the blending mode to exclusion and I brought it down to about 10%. It desaturates everything but gives it a bit of a hue as if this is a reposted screenshot. The second gradient map is also a heat map, just a different color scheme. And then I went down to exclusion and I dropped this one down to 8%. And this kind of fades and muddy things even a little bit more. The next step is the noise. This is just a black layer fill with the noise filter added onto it. And then I change the blending mode to color dodge. And it just adds noise. It adds a small amount of noise into the color. The second noise, I duplicated the first layer. It's the exact same layer, but I changed the blending mode to screen. 100% is way too much noise. I brought it down to 16%. Now there's now noise in the blacks and there's extra noise in the colors, and that's what we're going for. I made a new noise layer, but instead of monochromatic, I unchecked this and made sure it was color noise. So the color noise, I changed the blending mode down to difference, and then I changed it to 9%. First adjustment is a very simple curve. Bring down the shadows, bring up the highlights. Now you can see we're getting there. Next is a hue and saturation. I brought up the saturation and I tilted the hue just a tiny bit. Next step is posterization. This is important. It's scene specific. This exact scene, I use 78. What posterization does is it crunches down your scene into different layers. If you go too far, it just looks like a shitty JPEG, but if you bring it up high enough, the effects are noticeable, but they're not overwhelming. The next thing I added was a levels adjustment. I crunched in the blacks, I brought up the whites, and I changed the midtones. Everything's brighter and it's overblown. Next thing I added was another gradient map. This one's simple. This is just black to pale green. I then changed the blending mode to saturation and I brought it down to 21%. Now you can see the effects immediately. This makes it look more aged. It looks like it's a screenshot that's been shared of a shitty TV. If I turn it off, this is just a white glow, but here this adds color and noise, and it also brings out the posterization effect. The next adjustment is another hue and saturation. This time I brought the saturation down. You don't want it to be oversaturated, but you need the color to still be there. Remember, you're trying to replicate a screenshot of an old TV show or an old TV show directly, and sometimes they didn't have the best color. Final adjustment was another levels. This time was to crunch the blacks in, because even though these shows didn't have the best color range, the blacks were always really harsh and really dark and stood out. And then the next and final step is the most important. You go File, Export, Save as Web. Normally, when you're saving artwork to share, you want it the best quality possible, but that's not what we're going for. I changed my quality to very high, which brings it to about 80%. And then sometimes I add a little bit of blur if I'm feeling it. It's all very scene specific. And this is how I recreate the old anime look with Blender and Photoshop. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know.